Good evening, everyone. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. So now we're getting into Joseph and the famous story of Joseph going down to Egypt. So we're starting in Genesis chapter 37. Jacob settled the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the brothers of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Okay, so a couple fun things to start off right off the bat. So first of all, I grew up listening to Joseph and the Multicolored Dreamcoat CD all the time and the soundtrack, so I have those songs indelibly in my head. Now, the funny thing about that is, we now know is a strong word, but we now lean towards actually the multicolored coat being a bad translation, and it's probably actually this one, this long robe with sleeves. And why sleeves are a mark? Because adding the additional fabric and that stitching at that time would be very difficult. It's a lot easier just to punch two holes and create like a vest. And so that's why with sleeves are important, because it'd be a more expensive, much more fine worked piece of garment. And now, early on, remember what we talked about? I know, it's a little disappointing. Sleeves aren't as cool as like a big multicolored coat, but what are you going to do? Now, early on, remember how we talked about like polygamy and how polygamy causes all these problems? This is one of those big problems. So again, usually we should see brothers living in unity, and oftentimes we don't though. So we see him, they specify, he's working for his brothers, the sons of these other women. So he specifically specifies these are not direct, they're half-brothers. And so it creates this division. Not only that, but we see Jacob paying favorites. Joseph is the son of his favorite wife, and so he's getting special treatment. And then you can tell, early on, Joseph is kind of a brat. He just, this giving bad reports, basically he's a tattletale. You shouldn't tattle on your brothers. You should, that's not a good thing. You don't tattle on your brothers. And so we see that the brothers hate him, and to a certain extent, it's kind of understandable. Now, their reactions aren't going to be good, but you can kind of understand why this snot-nosed little thing who your dad gets all the attention and all the favors, and then he talks bad about you behind your back. You can see why they're not the favorites of Joseph. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. Well, this is going to be good. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly, my sheaf rose and stood upright, when your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. He had another dream. He told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I have had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What kind of dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, and his father kept the matter in mind. So this is also one just like lack of prudence. Okay, yeah, you had this dream, and as we know the end of the story, it's going to come true. But it's also probably how you say it. So you can almost see him how, well, I had a dream, and then they're all really annoyed at his dream. Well, I had another dream. And so it's like you can see like, okay, kid, you knew the first dream didn't go over too well. Maybe keep that to yourself. Now his brothers went to pasture, and the father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. He answered, Here I am. So he said to him, Go now, see if it is well with your brothers, and with the flock, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. So again, one of those things is you have to see, like, are people out of place? And this comes up a couple times. So we saw Lot when he's in the city. Why are you in the city? You're not supposed to be in the city. So we see Joseph, all your brothers are out pasturing. Why aren't you out pasturing? You should be out doing that. We're going to see that with King David. When all the other kings are at war, he's at home, and that leads to the Bathsheba incident. And so this is a literary device saying, well, if he's here and he's not where he's supposed to be, well, then that's going to lead to problems. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock?" The man said, "They have gone away. I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." So, it's pretty bad when you're so obnoxious that all of your brothers can contemplate murdering you, and they can all basically agree. So next we're going to see Reuben come up, and so this is going to be the B plot of this big story. So the A plot, of course, is Joseph, but the B plot is actually going to be Judah and Reuben. So Reuben is the oldest son, and last time we saw him sleep with one of his father's wives as kind of a usurping movement. And so we're going to see Reuben bring up ideas, and then Judah's going to bring up ideas, and we're going to see Judah gathering more and more sway. And Judah's going to become the biggest of the 12 tribes. Obviously, it's where Jews comes from today. That term comes from. And so we're seeing this shift from the oldest, who should be kind of the biggest, to Judah, who's going to take that place. But when Reuben heard it he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him to his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, and their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin, on the way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit it is that we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us send him with the Ishmaelites, and not lay our hands on him. For he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. Then some Midianites, traders, passed out and drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to the father, and they said, "This we found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father bewailed him, meaning the Midianites had sold him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of his guard. So this is the opening part of the story in the movie. So this is where now the story is going to really begin. This is just the groundwork. And now Reuben, so this is going back to Reuben. So he says, let's throw him in a pit, which sounds good, and it's better. But you're going to see that there's a weakness to Reuben. So he's the oldest. So by all traditions and all this one, he should be in charge. So he doesn't want Joseph to die. So he should say, no, let's not kill him. That's bad. So instead, he's taking this like secondary route where he's like, well, let's just throw him a pit. And then later on, I'll sneak back and get him out and I'll take him home. So he has this idea, well, why are you doing this backhanded way? If you're the oldest, be in charge. Don't be a coward. Don't go about it sneakily and backhandedly. No, tell him it's wrong and don't let him do it. And so then you can see Judah, while again, it's not a good idea, he has at least some sentiment for his brother. He is our flesh, so it's not a good that they sold him, but at least, well, first of all, they're listening to him, so that shows that he's kind of taking control and that he's being that leader in the group, and that he has some sense of fraternity because he's not killing him. The other image, too, is we're going to see this as like one of those beautiful foreshadowings of Christ being sold for 20 pieces of silver. And, of course, Christ will be betrayed by one of the 12 for 30 pieces, but for silver to the people. So the people who we should be able to trust betray him. So it's that same imagery and that same foreshadowing of Christ. Okay. It happened at that time when Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain... Okay, this is like a side plot, and it's a really interesting side plot. So this is a fun one. So Judah and Tamar is interesting. So remember that, so while Joseph was 17, these guys are all like 20 years older. So most of these are adults with their own kids and all families because of all of the wives and everything like that. It happened at this time that Judah went down from his brother and settled near a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. When then Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua, he married her and went into her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named her Again she conceived and bore a son, whom she named Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she named him Shelah. She was a Chezib when she bore him. Judah took a wife from his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. When Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law, and to her raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. Then when he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. So there's this tradition in Judaism where it's like if your older brother dies, you take the wife into your home. And you'll see this like Jesus, there's that, we saw that parable was, not parable, but that test that he was given. And so you then have a kid with her, and then that kid continues the line as a representation for your brother who died. So now we have this case where this woman who Judah promised to, two of his sons have died, and yet she still doesn't have an heir. And so now he's like a little worried. He's a little worried that she's almost a bad luck charm, but still he owes it to her to do this. So he's kind of like copping out on his responsibilities to this woman, especially when it very clarifies that it was not her fault. It was the sins of the other two. He said the first one was wicked, and then Onan wasn't respecting the marriage bed, wasn't respecting and treating her with the sexual dignities she deserved. So it's that sin of Onanism. And so that's why, so we have these two cases where it's not Tamar's fault. And now we're going to see, this is an interesting story. We're going to see, this is where one of the stories where God appreciates trickery. And that's why, like, he appreciates cleverness if you're doing cleverness for the right reason. So this is going to be the interesting one. So in course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. Then Judah's time of mourning was over. He went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you." For he did not know what she was, his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me, that you may come in to me?" He asked, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And he said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord, and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her, went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the kid by his friend, the Adulamite, to recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, "Where is the temple prostitute who was in Enaim by the wayside?" But they said, "No prostitute has been here." So they returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her. Moreover, the townspeople say, 'No prostitute has been here.'" Judah said, "Let her keep the things her own. Otherwise, he will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid, and you could not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom." And Judah said, "Bring her out, and let her be burned." And as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, whose they are, the signer and the cord and the staff." Then Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not lie with her again." When the time for her delivery came, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and bound on his hand a crimson thread, saying, "This one came out first." But just then he drew the hand back in, and out came his brother, and she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore he was named Perez. Afterwards his brother came out with the crimson thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. So what a weird story. This is not one you hear in Sunday school, but it's really, really interesting. First of all, Tamar is one of the specific women that when we talk about like the line of Christ, that she is mentioned. She is specifically mentioned, her and a couple other ones. And they both don't always have the best reputation. And so it's like, what is the point of this? Well, the point is, this is God using the weak to shame the strong. So Judah is this powerful king, this prince in his community, and he does whatever he wants, but he's not living up to his responsibilities with his sons and with his daughter-in-law. And so she kind of tricks him, dresses up as a prostitute because she needs to get from him what she is owed. And so she does this, and it's a weird way about going about it, but it's her only avenue. And so then when it comes out, this is like that story irony of, oh, he was fine going to a prostitute. It was fine for him to do that. But suddenly when he finds out his daughter-in-law is pregnant, he's like, oh, let's burn her at the stake. Let's kill her. And so then he comes out and it turns on that it was his. So it's that, again, this is not Judah does not come out looking good here. This is not Judah supposed to be strong. This is Judah looking a fool, and Tamar makes him look a fool. He wouldn't have had a problem if he would have done his responsibility in the first place and given his son to her. He wouldn't have had a problem if he hadn't treated her like a prostitute. He wouldn't have had a problem if he didn't try to murder her later and like do this kind of thing. So it's like every step of the way he makes the wrong choice, and then it leads into this thing. So it's actually meant to uphold Tamar. Tamar is not, it was revealed, she isn't a whore. She is not. She is getting what is owed to her, and this is what. And this is made more clear because through the line of Perez will be the line of Christ, and she is specifically named in that line. The other case of this will be similar is if you remember I don't know, we didn't get that far, but it's the I can't think of her name, but in the innkeeper in, what's the city that falls down? Now I can't think of it. Oh my gosh. Okay, when we come to it in Joshua, I'll remind her, and we'll go to Jericho there. So the innkeeper at Jericho, who helps the spies escape, she also becomes part of Israel, and she is also in the line of Christ. And so that's another one. Okay. So this is like, again, the B plot with Judah and with Reuben playing out. So it's a weird story, but it's one of those, do what you need to get into the line of Christ, and don't do bad things, then you won't have to deal with the consequences kind of stuff. But if you do it, the one good sign we see of Judah is that he actually does take responsibility. He does acknowledge it, and he does take that. So there's a little shining star. He doesn't look good in this, but at least he acknowledges it at the end. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard of an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites, who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of the Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in the sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From that time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there he had no concern for anything but the food that he ate. So this is very similar to the story of of Isaac going out to Laban. So we have Isaac who has to go out, and suddenly he's kind of led the favored life, and now he has to work for a living, and he does well, and he finds he can do well, and so now he's becoming more responsible. Joseph is doing the same thing. He was leading the very privileged life out of all the brothers, and now he's being put to work, and he's finding that the work suits him, and he's going to succeed in it. So it's a good thing to have that success, and it's not just that everything is easy, it's that he is now working hard. And just like Isaac working for Laban helped, Jacob, I don't know, we're mixing them. I'm too many names right now, helped him. So too, we're going to see Joseph be helped and is helping his master through his hard work. Now Joseph was handsome and good looking, and after a time his master's wife cast her eye on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look with me here. My master has no concern about anything in his house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in the house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie with her or be with her. One day, however, when he went out into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When he saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to him, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice to cry out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Then she kept his garment by her until his masters came home, and she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came to me and to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside him and fled outside." When his master heard the words of his wife had spoken to him, saying, "This is the way your servant treated me," he became enraged, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, and to the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So I never thought about this, but I'm making this connection now because we just read it back to back. But it's actually a perfect juxtaposition with Judah and Tamar and Joseph and Potiphar's wife, because we have a very similar story. We have Joseph is going to succeed where Judah failed. So Judah isn't living up to his responsibility. He is giving in to his sexual urges. And we have Joseph, who is meeting his responsibilities and succeeding for his masters, and then resisting the sexual temptations. And we even see a juxtaposition, too, where you see the garment gets left behind with each woman. So you have the pledges that get left behind with Tamar, and then you get the garment that get left behind with Joseph. And then it ends in the opposite ways, too, because we have Judah acknowledging the truth of the situation, and it turns out pretty good for both of them. And then we have Potiphar's wife, of course, lying about the situation, and it's going to lead bad. Now, eventually, this is going to be overall good. So, Joseph could, at this point, have kind of given up, but he continues to have the faith, and he continues to have that responsibility. And so then it ends, this is kind of that hopeful, this would be like the low point. So this is the Empire Strikes Back moment of like falling down. So because this is the low point. But there's that glimmer of hope, because even in prison, God is blessing him. The jailer is giving him responsibilities, and even in prison, he is being successful. And we're going to see how that eventually leads to his redemption, not only of his redemption, but of all the Hebrew people. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. So this is again showing you just the whims of the time. If you have this absolute monarch, it's really easy to be on his bad side. So you really have to have that constant success, because there's not exactly like employee rights at this time or anything like that. On another note, this doesn't actually matter that much, but Pharaoh just means king. It's just the Coptic or Egyptian word for king. So we kind of have this as his fancy title, but it just means king. I mean, specifically in Egypt, because of how it structures, it's very easy to have an absolute king, because it's easy to control all the lands of Egypt, because you just have to control that one river. But it's kind of like Caesar, where Caesar has taken on this kind of mythical thing, but it's just he's the chief guy. One night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." So Joseph said to them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So this is going to be the interesting, remember, we started with 2 dreams, and it was Joseph, and he kind of said them willy-nilly, and he didn't think about the consequences. Now it's flipped. He's going to be interpreting the dreams, and it's going to have major consequences. So again, it's just showing that maturity level. So instead of being the dreamer and being kind of blind to the consequences, he's going to be very aware of them. So it's that growth of his character is very evident. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms came out, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, 'This is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, but as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when it is well with you. Please do me the kindness to make mention of me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this place. For in fact, I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a pole, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. Well, that's not nearly as happy, not as good. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants. He lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But the chief baker he hanged, but just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Aw, shucks, Joseph. You're going to have to wait a little bit longer. After 2 whole years, so he's been hanging out for 2 years in prison. Now, this isn't prison like our prison. It's not just sitting in a locked room. It's probably more akin to like slavery, where you're going to be working and doing all these other things and that kind of stuff. So it's not that our prisons are pleasant, but this isn't a pleasant situation either. So you don't think of it like our prison. Think of it like being worked. Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and there came up out of the Nile 7 sleek and fat cows, and they grazed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and thin cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. Then he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 ears of grain, plump and good, and growing on one stalk. Then 7 ears, thin and blighted, by the east wind sprouted after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Pharaoh awoke, and it was a dream. In the morning his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called out for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my faults today. Once Pharaoh was angry with his servant and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. He dreamed on that same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own meaning. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When he told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each according to his dream. As he interpreted to us, so it turned out I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. When he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, it's kind of like being reborn. So, it's like that scene, again, in a movie, after you've like been in the rough and tumble or thing, you got to put on the nice clothes, and you're like a new man. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said that you, when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is not I, God. It is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, In my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile, and 7 cows, fat and sleek, came out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows came out after them, poor, very ugly and thin. Never had I seen such ugly ones in all the land of Egypt. The thin and ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows. But then they had eaten them. No one would have known that they had done so, for they were still as ugly as before. Then I awoke. I fell asleep a second time, and I saw in my dream 7 ears of grain, full and good, growing on one stalk, and 7 ears withering thin and blighted by that. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ones. But when I told it to my magicians, there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Okay, so just on a note, we're going to see his interpretation. And the interpretation seems pretty obvious in retrospect. And part of this is, though, we've already seen the Pharaoh kill a guy for displeasing him. So this is probably, and we're going to see this later on with like prophets and things, you don't want to give a bad report to the Pharaoh. So either the magicians might have had an idea of what it means and they're just not going to say it because they don't want to give a bad report, or they don't want to risk being wrong and then end up like the baker. So this could be one of those reasons, but again, we're going to see, or they just didn't understand and Joseph is better at interpreting dreams. All of this could be coming into play. But in all of it, the key part is that Joseph is giving all the credit to God, and he's keeping that faith, and again, early on, he was all about building himself up, and now we're seeing him much more humbled and much more, he's taken on that responsibility. So we've seen Joseph grow up a lot. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, as are the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh that he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout the land of Egypt. After them there will arise 7 years of famine, and the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land. The plenty will no longer be known in the land because of the famine that will follow, for it will be very grievous. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that this thing is fixed by God, and God will surely bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. Let them gather all the food of these good years after that are coming, and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. The food shall be a reserve of the land against the 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish throughout the famine. So, we've seen again how whenever anyone puts Joseph in charge, again, this is a literary device, so we're supposed to see this coming. And every time Joseph is put in charge, that thing succeeds really well, whether it's in prison or in Potiphar's house. And now he kind of ends, and I don't know if you're supposed to read this as if he's hinting or not, but it doesn't really go either. But we all know who's going to be put in charge, because he already has the ideas. And you can see Pharaoh just be like, yeah, let's do that. And you've already done this really well, so yeah, you're going to be the guy in charge. The proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find anyone else like this, one to whom is the Spirit of God? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt, removing his signet ring from his hand. Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arranged him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command, And they cried out in front of him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift one hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh gave Joseph the name, Zaphenath-Paneah. Well, we're just something in Egyptian. And he gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as his wife. Thus Joseph gained authority over the land of Egypt. On an interesting side note, this is one where history actually really backs up this claim. Not specifically that there's a Hebrew who was in charge, but we do know that Egypt and ancient Egypt had a very top-down hierarchy, and not only that, they had a very centralized government. And again, because you just have to go up and down the Nile, it's really easy to control. So we know for a fact that they did highly regulate what everyone was growing along the Nile, because it's literally the Nile and a mile, and not even a mile in each direction, and that's it. And so because of that, it's really easy to control. And so they were very centralized. So this idea of going around and collecting all the food and having these central things was how it happened. That is how it worked. Taxes were paid in grain and things like that. And so that is where the history really backs up this central organization of Egypt. Now, obviously, historically, you're not going to be able to prove if there's one Hebrew running around, and we also know that there were definitely times of feast and famine and things like that too, so that they would stock up for bad years, and then they would pass it back out. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh's king of Egypt. So he was 17 when he left, so he's been away for 13 years, and you can kind of figure out how many years he was in different sections, and so now he's kind of come into his own. And Joseph went out from the presence of the Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. He gathered up all the food of the 7 years when there was plenty in the land of Egypt, and stored up food in the cities. He stored up in every city the food from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it. It was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, Joseph had 2 sons, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me forget all my hardships and all my father's house." The second was named Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortunes. So Joseph is going to be interesting. So of course we're going to see the 12 tribes be the 12 brothers become the 12 tribes of Israel. But Joseph doesn't get a tribe, and it's because his 2 sons become what they call the half tribes. So it's the half tribes of Manasseh and the half tribe of, and I can never remember the other one, and I just read Ephraim. So Ephraim and Manasseh are the 2 half tribes. And so you won't really see areas referred to as Joseph. You'll refer to it, there's Reuben and Judah and Benjamin, and then there's Manasseh and thing. And this is a weird reflection even in our own apostles, because if you see the apostles, of course you have the 12 apostles, which we trace down, but there's also 2 half apostles, because after Judas, they replace him with Matthias, but they also replace him with Paul. Both are considered apostles, and if you ever see the list, if there's the churches with 12 windows and they have the apostles in all of them, it's always the guess of are they going to do Paul or are they going to do Matthias? And it's like a 50-50 shot. So I always thought that was kind of funny that even with the apostles, there's 2 half apostles, and it even reflects in that. I don't know if there's a deeper meaning to that. I just think it's cool. The 7 years of plenty that prevailed in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come. Just as Joseph had said, there was a famine in every country, but throughout the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." And since the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to all the Egyptians. For the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine became severe throughout the world. Okay, so I think we're going to stop there for tonight, because that's a good time. And then the next one, we'll finish up the story of Joseph next time with all the brothers coming down and establishing that. And this is kind of, we're actually getting now actually close to the end of Genesis, because of course we're going to end in Genesis, and we already know, because we're already ahead of the game, because we already did Exodus. But we're gonna stop there, and so next time we're gonna see the climax, the conclusion of the story of Joseph and the brothers coming down. Okay, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. It was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. You all have a good night, and God bless.